The winter wind came howling across the Dakota Territory prairie on the night of December 28, 1868, turning the world beyond Josephine Mabel Hart's homestead into a writhing wall of white that obliterated every distinction between earth and sky. Snow did not merely fall. It drove horizontal with the force of grape shot propelled by a gale that had been building strength for 3 days without mercy. Each gust carried the weight of malice, as if the prairie itself had turned hostile to human habitation and sought to scrub clean every trace of settlement from its ancient, indifferent face. Inside the log cabin, Josephine crouched before the stone hearth like a supplicant before an altar coaxing reluctant flame from the last fragments of split pine. The fire represented more than warmth. It was the thin barrier between life and the kind of death that came slowly, stealing sensation from extremities, first then creeping inward toward the heart with patient cruelty. Without this fire, the temperature inside these 4 walls would plummet to killing cold before dawn, and she would wake rigid and blue if she woke at all. She was 34 years old, though the mirror showed someone who might claim a decade more. 3 years of widowhood on the frontier had carved lines around her mouth, and eyes had roughened her hands until they resembled cottonwood bark had stolen the softness from her figure and replaced it with lean, sinewy strength. Her fingers trembled as she fed another stick into the struggling flames, though whether from cold or exhaustion she could no longer distinguish. Thomas had built this cabin in the spring of 1865, returning from the war with a musket ball still lodged near his spine and dreams of a future carved from wilderness through honest labor. He had been a good man, steady in temperament, gentle in manner, possessed of quiet strength that needed no display. They had met in Pennsylvania, where she had worked in her father's dry goods store, tallying accounts with a precision Thomas had found both impressive and intimidating. Their courtship had been brief, conducted largely through letters after he returned west to establish the claim. His correspondence had painted pictures of endless grassland, of skies so vast they induced vertigo, of soil rich enough to yield abundance to anyone willing to break it properly. She had believed every word because she wanted to believe, because remaining in Pennsylvania meant spinsterhood and suffocation under her father's roof. Because the war had killed so many young men that a proposal from any decent prospect seemed a gift not to be questioned. The reality of Dakota Territory had struck her like a physical blow upon arrival. The cabin was smaller than described, more crude. The land was not rich, but rocky, prone to flooding along the creek and drought on higher ground. The nearest town, White Buffalo, was 6 miles distant over trails that became impassable in heavy weather. But she had set her jaw and determined to make the best of choices already made. Then in the summer of 1866, cholera had swept through the scattered settlements like the angel of death. Thomas had gone to help a Mexican family whose patriarch had fallen ill and had returned home with the sickness already burning in his gut. He died in 4 days, his body racked with convulsions that left him a hollow shell. She buried him behind the barn in ground so hard she had to soak it with buckets of water before the shovel would bite. No minister presided, and she spoke the words herself, her voice steady because tears would accomplish nothing. She had kept the homestead through desperation and stubbornness that surprised even herself. She sold eggs, candles made from rendered tallow, small items of needlework, to the few women who had money for such luxuries. Every penny was hoarded against the day when crop failure or illness or simple bad luck would require cash to survive. The war's end had brought changes. Soldiers mustered out with nowhere to go drifted west seeking opportunity or escape. The railroads, having proven their worth moving troops, now turned their resources towards spanning the continent. Railroad agents appeared in towns like White Buffalo, surveying routes, purchasing right-of-way, promising prosperity through connection to eastern markets. With the railroad came cattle. Vast herds driven up from Texas by men made hard by war, seeking fortunes in beef-hungry eastern cities. The cattlemen brought money and jobs, but also violence, competing claims, and casual disregard for anyone who had arrived before them and lacked strength to defend what they held. The Sioux had been here longest. The Fort Laramie Treaty signed earlier this year had promised them ownership of the Black Hills and hunting rights across vast territory. But already there were rumors of gold in those hills, and where gold appeared, treaties dissolved like frost under summer sun. All these forces pressed against each other in unstable equilibrium. Violence flickered along the edges, stock-stolen homesteads burned, travelers ambushed. Each side blamed the others. It was the kind of situation in which small sparks could ignite conflagrations, and men with particular interests worked diligently to provide those sparks. Josephine understood little of this larger context. Her world had contracted to 40 acres, 1 cabin, 1 cow, 1 mule, and daily struggle to extract life from grudging land. What mattered was whether the well would freeze, whether the roof would hold, whether she had enough provisions to reach spring. But tonight, all those forces grinding against each other were about to intersect with her life in ways that would leave nothing unchanged. Over the storm's scream, she heard something else. A faint scratch at the door, deliberate and purposeful, repeated with desperate insistence. Josephine's head snapped up, her body tensing. Her first thought was animal, perhaps a coyote driven to boldness by starvation. But coyotes did not scratch with that particular rhythm, that almost human quality of plea. Her eyes went to the Sharp's carbine leaning against the stone mantel. The weapon was a .52 caliber breech-loading rifle, one of the technological marvels that had emerged from the war years. Unlike old muzzle loaders, the Sharps could be fired, reloaded, and fired again in under 10 seconds by practiced hands. Thomas had purchased it the year before his death, trading a month's worth of eggs for the rifle and ammunition. She took up the weapon, checking that a cartridge was seated and a percussion cap fixed. The rifle was always kept loaded, an empty gun was merely an expensive club, and the seconds required to load could decide between life and death. The scratching came again, weaker now. Something was dying out there. Every instinct screamed at her to bar the door and return to the fire. Opening that door meant inviting in the cold, risking attack, potentially exposing herself to human threats, using distress as ruse. But she had been raised Methodist, and while 3 years of frontier survival had stripped away much soft idealism, certain fundamental convictions remained embedded too deep to ignore. Among those was the belief that mercy shown to the least of creatures counted for something, even if that accounting never actually came. She moved to the door, rifle raised, and lifted the heavy oak bar. The wind immediately shoved against it with such force she nearly lost her grip. Snow blasted through the gap, stinging her face. She squinted and looked down. A child lay crumpled on the threshold. The figure was small, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, dressed in buckskin, decorated with quill work, now crusted with ice. Long black hair hung in frozen ropes around a face gone blue-white. The child's legs below the knee were bare moccasins reduced to tatters. Blood had soaked through rawhide tied around the upper arm. Sue? The recognition hit with physical force. This was a Sioux child, one of the hostiles, blamed for every missing cow, every burned shack, every act of violence across the territory. And she was dying while somewhere in that white hell someone was hunting her. Proof came immediately. A rifle shot cracked through the storm, followed seconds later by another. Men were out there tracking this child, even through conditions that made travel suicidal. She had perhaps 5 seconds to decide. Push the child back into the storm bar, the door claim ignorance. The girl would be dead within the hour, buried under snow. It was the safe choice, the rational choice. The child's eyes fluttered open, brown and glazed, and fixed on Josephine's face with desperate hope. Lips moved, forming a word in unknown language, but the meaning transcended speech help. Damnation. Josephine whispered the strongest profanity her upbringing permitted. She slung the Sharps over her shoulder, bent down, and lifted the child. The girl weighed almost nothing, cold as a corpse. Josephine kicked the door shut, dropped the bar, and carried her burden to the hearth. Behind her, beyond the walls, invisible riders circled through darkness on horses pushed past endurance, searching for prey that had slipped into shelter they dared not assault directly. Not yet. Josephine laid the child before the fire and knelt beside her mind, racing through half-remembered medical knowledge from Thomas's battered copy of Gunn's Domestic Medicine. First priority: remove wet clothing to stop heat loss. She worked quickly, peeling away frozen buckskin with clumsy fingers. The quillwork decoration, intricate geometric patterns, spoke of hours of patient labor by someone who loved this child. The thought caught in Josephine's throat, but she pushed feeling aside. Beneath the outer layer, the girl wore a doeskin shift, also wet. This came off, revealing a body showing lean hardness of outdoor life, but also jutting ribs of inadequate nutrition. Winter was starving time for Sioux as much as settlers. The arm wound drew her attention. The rawhide strip served as bandage, but blood had soaked through and frozen. Josephine heated water and set about cleaning the injury. The bullet had carved a groove along the bicep, deep enough to expose muscle but missing bone and major vessels. It would heal if infection could be prevented. She had no carbolic acid. Antiseptic supplies were impossible to obtain. Only whiskey, nearly as precious as gold. The child whimpered when alcohol hit exposed flesh, but did not wake, which was mercy. Josephine cleaned away frozen blood and dirt, then bound the arm with strips torn from an old petticoat. The feet worried her more. The toes had gone translucent white that preceded blackening and tissue death. She had seen frostbite before a trapper had lost toes to gangrene after similar exposure. Josephine filled a basin with lukewarm water and submerged the child's feet, massaging gently. The medical text had been specific: gradual warming was essential. While she worked, she studied the child's face. 9 or 10 years old. High cheekbones, straight nose, the kind of face that would be beautiful with maturity. The girl's breathing was rapid and shallow, her skin hot despite hypothermia. Fever was already setting in. "Can you hear me?" Josephine asked softly, though she knew the girl likely spoke no English. No response. The child's eyes remained closed, though they moved beneath the lids. Josephine wrapped her in every blanket she owned, wool blankets from Pennsylvania, the quilt her mother had made Thomas's old coat. She built up the fire, feeding it wood she could ill afford to burn. Only when the immediate crisis was addressed did she consider larger implications. She had taken in a Sioux child, sheltered an enemy. The hunters would come. They would demand. And if she refused to surrender the child, they would take her by force and burn the cabin. And if the hunters did not come, other Sioux would come looking. Parents or siblings who would have reason to believe a white woman had stolen or harmed their child. 3 years of violence had taught both sides to expect the worst. She was caught between hammer and anvil, damned regardless of choice. "What is your name, child?" Josephine whispered. The girl's lips moved. "Winona." Josephine started. The girl was conscious, floating between waking and sleep. "Winona," Josephine repeated. "I am Josephine. You are safe here." The girl's eyes opened to slits brown and glassy with fever. She spoke rapid Lakota, her good hand clutching at air as if grasping for something lost. One word emerged repeatedly with fervor of prayer, ate, and another, tatanka. Josephine recognized neither word had no reference for their meaning. But the tone needed no translation. This child was looking for someone, father, protector, family. Someone named Tatanka. Someone who was not here. "Sleep now," Josephine said gently, pressing the child down when she tried to rise. "Sleep and heal. Whatever comes, we will face it when it arrives." Winona's eyes closed, and within seconds her breathing settled into deeper rhythm. The fever burned on, but for now the child lived. That was something. Josephine stood and walked to the window, peering out at the storm. Snow had piled in drifts against the cabin walls. The world beyond was featureless white visibility reduced to mere feet. If men were still hunting, they were invisible, swallowed by the blizzard. But they would come. When the storm broke, when visibility returned, when pursuit could resume. They would come, and Josephine would have to decide how far she was willing to go to protect a child she did not know who belonged to a people with every reason to hate her kind. She checked the sharps again, then pulled down the old flintlock musket. 2 rifles, perhaps 30 cartridges for the sharps, powder and ball for the musket, a Colt Army revolver with a dozen loose cartridges, not an arsenal, but enough to make any assault costly. She returned to the fire and sat beside the sleeping girl, staring into flames that danced in hypnotic patterns. Outside, the wind continued its assault, but inside this small space, warmth and firelight created an illusion of safety that was dangerously deceptive. She had crossed a threshold tonight without fully understanding implications. She had chosen mercy over safety, had extended humanity across a gulf of enmity, had bet her life on the value of one child's survival. Whether that choice had been nobility or foolishness, she would learn soon enough. Morning came slowly, the sun rising blood-red over a landscape transformed into an alien white desert. The storm had exhausted itself before dawn, leaving behind silence so profound it felt threatening. Josephine stood at the window and surveyed a world simultaneously simplified and complicated by the night's events. Snow lay in massive drifts, sculpted by wind into fantastic shapes that caught early light. The barn was half buried, only the roof visible. The fence had vanished entirely. The pristine white stretched away toward impossibly distant horizons. But the simplicity was deceptive. Tracks marked the snow around the cabin, hoofprints from unshod ponies, boot prints from men on foot, drag marks of something heavy. Someone had circled the homestead during the night, had approached close enough to touch the walls, had examined every angle. They had not attacked, had not called out, had simply observed and withdrawn. Waiting. Josephine's hands tightened on the window frame. They knew. Whoever had been hunting Winona, they knew the child was here, knew a white woman had taken her in. Behind her, Winona stirred, making a small sound of distress. Josephine knelt beside the girl, placing a hand on her forehead. Still feverish, but perhaps marginally cooler. The arm wound looked clean, no red streaks indicating blood poisoning. The feet showed better color. The child would likely keep all her toes if infection could be prevented. "Winona," Josephine said softly, "can you wake for me? I need you to drink." The girl's eyes opened, more alert now, though still clouded with fever. She looked at Josephine with wariness, but also desperate hope, the expression of someone who had been pursued and hurt and was now being offered kindness. Josephine lifted Winona's head and brought a tin cup of water to her lips. The girl drank greedily, coughing when she swallowed too fast, then drank more slowly. "Pilamaya." Winona whispered, "Thank you." "You are welcome," Josephine replied. She gestured to herself. "Josephine," then pointed to the girl. "Winona," then made a questioning gesture about the name heard last night. Understanding flickered in Winona's eyes. She touched her chest. "Winona," then pointed toward the door. "Ate, Tatanka Sistina." Father Josephine guessed. Tatanka was her father, and he was out there somewhere, looking for his daughter. Josephine tried another question, gesturing to Winona's wounded arm and mimicking someone shooting. "Who shot you?" Winona's face contorted with fear and grief. She launched into rapid Lakota, gesturing frantically to illustrate a narrative Josephine could only partially follow. She caught fragments: Wasiku white men, Wikakte killed, and a word that sounded like Ina, repeated with anguish, mother. Josephine's chest tightened. This child had watched her mother die, had been shot and hunted through a blizzard, was now orphaned and terrified, taking refuge with a stranger whose kindness was still uncertain. "I am sorry," Josephine said quietly. "I am so very sorry for your loss." Winona pointed at the door and then made gestures that could mean approach or arrival. "Ate, tatanka sistina, haya tokecha." She held up fingers, many fingers, both hands. 10, 20, more. She swept her hand in a circle indicating surrounding. Then she made a motion like shooting but shook her head emphatically and pointed at Josephine. "No shoot." Understanding arrived. Winona was warning her. Her father was coming with many men. They would surround the cabin. But they were not the enemy, not the ones who had shot her. Do not shoot at them. "Your father is coming," Josephine said slowly. "Tatanka, with warriors, but they did not hurt you." Winona nodded vigorously, relief washing across her face. "Han, yes, ate." Then her expression changed to fear, and she grabbed Josephine's hand. "Wasikusika, bad white men, wikakte ina." Bad white men had attacked their winter camp, killed people, killed her mother, and were still out there, still hunting. Josephine's mind raced. If Winona was telling the truth, then white men had raided a Sioux camp, murdered civilians, including women, and were hunting survivors to prevent witnesses. Which meant those same men would not hesitate to kill a white woman who had sheltered an inconvenient witness. And it meant when Tatanka arrived, he would have every reason to suspect Josephine of being part of the group that had attacked his people. The obvious conclusion would be kidnapping. She was balanced on a knife's edge between two groups of armed, angry men. Before she could pursue that thought further, hoofbeats sounded outside, many hoofbeats approaching in coordinated formation. Josephine moved to the window and felt her breath catch. Riders were emerging from the landscape, coming from the creek direction in slow, inexorable advance. One line appeared then, another, then more, spreading in a widening arc. Within 5 minutes, the homestead was completely encircled by mounted Sioux warriors. She counted quickly. 70, 75, perhaps 80. They formed a perfect circle, sitting their ponies in absolute stillness, cutting off every possible escape. The horses stood motionless, despite the cold breath steaming. The warriors wore blankets against the cold, some decorated with elaborate quillwork, others plain wool. They carried mixed weapons, old trade muskets, a few modern rifles, bows strung despite the cold. Their faces were weathered, marked by lives lived outdoors, and utterly unreadable. At the head of the formation rode a man who commanded attention through sheer presence. He was perhaps 40, powerfully built, sitting his paint stallion with easy grace. His hair was long and black, bound with red cloth, 2 eagle feathers tied into the braid with precision. He wore buckskin leggings decorated with quill work, a dark blue wool shirt, and a blanket bearing marks of hard use. His face arrested her attention, most carved from experience and loss and strength beyond mere physical power. Old scars marked his knuckles and forearms, but his eyes struck her most forcefully dark. Penetrating, filled with intelligence that saw through pretense and calculated odds with ruthless precision. This, Josephine knew with absolute certainty, was Tatanka, Winona's father, a war leader who would do whatever was necessary to protect his daughter and his people. Behind her, Winona made a sound, half sob, half cry of desperate hope. "Ate, Tatanka Sistina." Josephine turned to see the girl trying to rise despite weakness, reaching toward the door, tears streaming down her face. The child's relief was absolute and genuine. She truly believed her father had come to save her. Which meant Josephine's best chance of surviving was to demonstrate immediately that she posed no threat to the child and had preserved her life. She moved to the door, unbarred it, and pushed it open despite the rushing cold. Winona stumbled forward wrapped in blankets, her damaged feet barely supporting her, but determination overriding pain. Tatanka had already dismounted and was walking toward the cabin, his rifle held ready, but not quite aimed, his eyes constantly assessing threats. His face, when he saw Winona, showed a flash of emotion so intense it was painful to witness, relief and grief and fury compressed into one moment before the mask of control descended. He spoke in Lakota, his voice rough with barely checked emotion. Winona answered in a torrent, gesturing at Josephine at her arm at the cabin. The conversation was rapid and intense, incomprehensible to Josephine, but clearly explanation and reassurance. Tatanka's eyes moved from his daughter to Josephine, and for a long moment he studied her with focused attention. Then he spoke, his English rough but comprehensible. "You took my daughter." Not quite a question, not quite an accusation, but something demanding answer. "She came to my door last night," Josephine said, keeping her voice level despite fear. "During the storm, wounded and freezing, I brought her inside and treated her injuries. That is all. Where is her mother?" The question came flat, but Josephine heard the grief beneath the barely controlled fury born of loss. "I do not know," Josephine answered honestly. "She was alone when I found her. She has tried to tell me what happened, but I do not speak your language well enough. I think I believe white men attacked your camp, killed people. Your daughter was shot and hunted. She came here seeking shelter, and I gave it." Tatanka's jaw tightened, muscles bunching. "Your people killed my wife, murdered her while she prepared morning meal, shot her down like an animal, then hunted my daughter through blizzard for sport or to silence a witness. And now I find her with you. Why should I believe you were not part of that?" It was a fair question. From his perspective, finding his wounded daughter with a white woman proved nothing except proximity. For all he knew, she was one of the raiders keeping Winona alive for ransom, playing some deeper game. Before she could answer, a rifle shot cracked from somewhere beyond the circle of warriors, sharp and clear in the cold morning air. One of Tatanka's men, a young warrior perhaps 20, pitched from his horse with a cry of pain. He hit the snow hard, and blood immediately began spreading dark beneath him, steaming in the cold. The shot had not come from the cabin. It had come from the ridge beyond, from the line of scrub pine and boulders that marked the creek boundary. Every warrior in the circle reacted instantly, rifles coming up boughs, appearing men dismounting or wheeling horses to face the actual threat. And for one crucial moment, Tatanka's eyes met Josephine's, and understanding passed between them. Someone wanted them to kill each other. Someone had fired deliberately to provoke exactly the massacre that would serve particular interests. "Wait!" Josephine shouted to the warriors, beginning to knock arrows. "It was not me. Not from here. Look at the ridge." But chaos was already beginning to unfold. Arrows hissed through the air, slamming into the cabin logs with solid thunks. Josephine yanked the door shut and threw the latch. Splinters exploded from the doorframe as an arrow punched through the iron tip, stopping inches from her face. "Down!" Josephine barked at Winona, who was trying to crawl toward the door. Another shot cracked from the ridge. A warrior's pony screamed and collapsed, kicking. The rider rolled clear, bringing his rifle up. Josephine's mind raced. If she fired back at the warriors, they would kill her. If she did nothing, they would assume guilt and storm the cabin. She needed to prove the real enemy was out there. Her eyes fell on the sharps. It was loaded. One shot, enough to kill a man. But instead of raising it to the window to fire at the warriors, she made a choice against every instinct of self-preservation. She thrust the loaded rifle into Winona's shaking hands. The girl stared at the weapon with pure terror. The sharps was far too heavy for a child her size. "Go to him," Josephine said, speaking slowly. "Your father, Tatanka, Show him I gave you this weapon. If I wanted him dead, I would have kept it. Do you understand? This is the only way we all survive. Winona's breath came in panicked gasps. She looked at the rifle, then at Josephine, then at the door, where arrows continued to thud into wood. Go, Josephine repeated gentler, but no less urgent. He is your father. He will not hurt you. But you have to go now. Right now. The girl took a shuddering breath. She clutched the sharps to her chest and staggered to the door. Josephine lifted the latch and pushed it open, exposing them both to the cold and chaos. Winona stepped into the doorway, silhouetted against firelight behind her, a small figure carrying a rifle nearly as tall as herself. Snow lashed her face. She called out in Lakota, her voice high and clear and desperate, cutting through the sound of men shouting and horses stamping. Ate, ate, father, father. Tatanka crouched behind his fallen horse with his rifle raised and sighted on the cabin door, looked up. His face went white as bone. Everything seemed to stop. He shouted something in Lakota, sharp and commanding his voice, carrying absolute authority. The warriors held. Arrows stayed nocked, but not released. Rifles stayed raised, but fingers eased on triggers. Tatanka rose slowly and walked toward his daughter with measured steps, ignoring the risk of another unseen shot from the ridge. His eyes never left Winona's face, but Josephine could see the tension in every line of his body. Winona lifted the sharps with both hands, her wounded arm, crying out in protest, and held it out to him like an offering or proof. She spoke rapidly in Lakota words, tumbling over each other. Tatanka took the rifle from his daughter's trembling hands with reverence. He checked the chamber with practiced efficiency, saw the loaded cartridge, felt the weight of the percussion cap. His gaze lifted slowly to Josephine, who stood unarmed with her hands empty and open. She could have killed me with this, Tatanka said quietly, his English rough but precise. Could have shot me the moment I rode close. You gave her that power, put it in her hands. I gave her the choice. Josephine answered, her voice steady despite adrenaline. I gave her the proof that I mean no harm. If I wanted you dead, I would have kept the rifle and used it. A second shot whined through the air, striking a saddle horn with a metallic clang. This time, Tatanka saw exactly what Josephine had seen, the faint puff of white gun smoke rising from the low ridge beyond the circle, a quarter-mile distant, half hidden by scrub pine. Not from the house, not from the cabin, from the trees. His eyes narrowed with the look of a predator identifying real prey. He barked orders in Lakota, rapid and clipped, gesturing toward the ridge. The warriors turned as one using their horses and terrain for cover repositioning to face the actual threat. Josephine dropped to one knee beside the doorway and reached for the old flintlock musket. She checked the priming, made sure it was dry, and sighted along the barrel at the same line of trees. For the first time since the riders appeared, she and Tatanka were aiming in the same direction, facing a common enemy. Someone out there wanted them to kill each other, and that someone had just made a fatal miscalculation. The sniping continued through the afternoon, sporadic and deadly. A pony went down, screaming, its legs shattered by a rifle ball. Another warrior caught a bullet in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him into the snow. His companions dragged him to cover. A round punched through the cabin wall with a sharp crack, spraying flour from a shattered tin across the floor. The bullet buried itself in the opposite wall. The cabin smelled like gunpowder, fear smoke, and blood. Josephine and Tatanka began to move like seasoned partners without discussing strategy. He would call out positions in clipped English, pointing toward muzzle flashes in the trees. There. 2 men. Left side. Pine tree. She reloaded for him, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. The sharps used paper cartridge and percussion cap. Tear the cartridge, pour the powder and ball down the breech, close the action, place the cap. She could do it in under 20 seconds. She slammed cartridges into his hand and passed the rifle back without looking. Their fingers brushed once, twice, a dozen times, quick jolts of contact that neither acknowledged verbally, but that registered nonetheless. His hands were calloused from a lifetime of hard work, scarred from old wounds, warm despite the cold. Hers were rough from 2 years of labor, trembling slightly from adrenaline, smaller than his, but capable. The contact lasted only heartbeats, but something passed between them in those moments, recognition perhaps, or the fragile beginning of trust forged in survival. Inside the cabin, Winona's fever climbed higher. Her skin burned to the touch, dry and papery. She began to talk in a feverish stream, words tumbling out in Lakota and broken English fragments of memory spilling without filter. She spoke of a dawn attack 2 days ago in a winter camp along the Missouri River breaks. Men with full beards and blue coats like soldiers had ridden into the sleeping village just as the sun touched the horizon, guns blazing without warning. Her mother had shoved Winona into a narrow crevice in the rocks, covering her with a buffalo robe, and told her to stay silent no matter what she heard. Then the guns had spoken, and her mother had fallen face down in the snow blood, spreading dark beneath her body, while Winona watched through a gap in the buffalo robe and bit her own hand to keep from screaming. Winona had stayed hidden until the men left. She had watched as one man bigger than the others, with a cruel face, half hidden by a thick beard, heated a branding iron in campfire coals. The iron glowed red, then orange, then yellow-white. He had pressed it against the hide of a dead Sioux pony, holding it there, despite the smell of burning hair and flesh, laughing about how the stupid settlers will think the savages stole their stock now. The brand was a crooked M inside a circle. M, Winona whispered now in her fever, tracing the shape in the air with her finger. Circle, M bad man. Killed Ina. Killed everyone. Killed. Josephine's blood ran cold, her hand stilling on the powder horn. She knew that brand. She had seen it burned into the hide of a dead horse she had found 2 months ago near the creek boundary, the image that had troubled her thoughts without understanding why until this moment, when understanding came like a physical blow. That brand belonged to Dark Dave Mallory, and the man Sheriff Harlan bought cheap beef from every month without asking inconvenient questions. In White Buffalo, 6 miles to the east, news arrived like wildfire. A ranch hand named Johnson burst into the saloon just past noon, his hat gone, his coat torn, his eyes wild. "Indians got the Hart place surrounded," he shouted. 70 of them. Maybe more Sioux warriors on horseback armed with rifles. They got that widow woman pinned down, probably already dead and scalped by now. The saloon erupted. Men grabbed rifles from pegs on the walls, checked revolvers, shouted questions and curses. The air filled with the smell of unwashed bodies, spilled whiskey, tobacco smoke, and something uglier, the scent of men smelling blood and opportunity. Sheriff Harlan stood at the bar, a glass of whiskey in one thick hand. He let the panic build for a long moment before raising his voice. "All right, boys, settle down. We will ride out there and see what is what. But I need every man who can shoot straight. If the Sioux are moving this bold, this close to town, then this could be the start of something big. Real big. Could be the uprising we have been hearing rumors about." He let that sink in. A Sioux uprising would mean federal troops, which meant government contracts and spending. It would mean railroad money flowing freely. It would mean land claims being abandoned or seized opportunities for men willing to take risks. Abraham Cole sat in the corner, nursing a cup of cold coffee. He had been thinking about a lot of things lately. He had been thinking about the cattle he had purchased from Mallory over the past year, 20 head at prices so low that he should have asked more questions. He had been thinking about the rumors. And now he was thinking about Josephine Hart alone on that homestead with a target painted on her back, and what it would mean if this drunken, angry posse rode in shooting first. "Maybe you are riding to the wrong side of the fight," he muttered, not quite loud enough for Harlan to hear. "You turning soft on us, Abraham." one of the ranchers sneered. That widow is as good as dead already, probably scalped by now. You want to side with hostiles? Abraham did not answer. He finished his coffee, stood with a grunt of pain as his bad hip protested a rebel Minier ball at Gettysburg had shattered the joint and left him crippled, and walked out into the cold. Outside, Estelle Laurent stood in the doorway of the general store, arms crossed, face pale. She had heard every word through the thin walls. "They are going to get her killed," she said in French to herself, then louder in English to Abraham as he limped past. "If there are wounded, they will need Dr. Walter." Abraham stopped, looked at her, then at the crowd forming. He thought about the medal he still carried from Gettysburg and the one they gave him for dragging 3 wounded men out of a burning farmhouse while Confederate riflemen shot at him. He had not felt like a hero then. He felt even less like one now. But some debts could only be paid in one currency. He turned his horse toward the edge of town, where Dr. Walter Finch kept his office above the general store. Dr. Walter was already packing his medical bag when Abraham knocked. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed from too much coffee cut with whiskey and too little sleep, and nodded once as if he had been expecting this. "How bad?" Walter asked. "Do not know yet," Abraham admitted, "but you are going to want to bring everything." Walter grabbed his heavy coat, his worn medical bag, his hat, and followed Abraham down the stairs with resigned determination. Estelle met them at the stable, already holding the reins of Walter's horse. "I am coming with you," she announced in a tone that brooked no argument. "The hell you are." Abraham started to object. "This is going to be a shooting situation. You will get yourself killed. If there are children involved, they will need someone who can communicate." She shot back, her French accent thickening. "I speak some Lakota. Not much, but enough. And if that little girl is the witness, you think she might be someone needs to keep her alive long enough to tell her story. That someone is me." Walter glanced at Abraham, who sighed with the air of a man recognizing a lost argument. "Stay behind us, far behind us. And if shooting starts, you turn around and ride the other direction. Understood?" Estelle nodded, though Abraham suspected she had no intention of following that order. They rode out of White Buffalo into the frozen prairie, 3 people who had no business riding into a war zone, but could not live with themselves if they stayed behind. Behind them, the posse was still organizing, still drinking liquid courage. Abraham, Walter, and Estelle had perhaps a 30-minute head start. It would have to be enough. Night fell early in the Dakota winter, the sun dropping below the horizon at 4:30 and taking all warmth with it. The temperature plummeted. The wind dropped to an eerie calm that made every sound carry voices: the creak of saddle leather, the snort of horses, the distant crack of a rifle shot. Between the sporadic gunfire, the silence was oppressive, heavy with anticipation and dread. 2 of Dark Dave's men brothers named Frank and Jesse Tolliver, wanted for murder in 3 territories, crept down from the ridge under cover of approaching darkness, moving low and careful. Each man carried a bottle filled with coal oil, a rag stuffed into the neck. Their orders from Mallory were simple light: the cabin on fire, burn everyone inside, and let the blame fall on savage tactics that would inflame every settler from the Missouri River to Fort Pierre. Tatanka spotted their movement first. His eyes, trained by decades of hunting and warfare, picked out the unnatural shapes slipping between the scrub pines. He touched Josephine's shoulder without speaking, a brief contact that made her pulse jump, and pointed. She saw them. 2 men hunched low, maybe 60 yards out, and closing. Her mouth went dry. If they reached the cabin with those bottles, everyone inside would burn alive. They did not speak. There was no time. Josephine moved to the window on the left, easing the shutter open just enough to create a narrow firing port. Tatanka took the right, his movements utterly silent, the sharps already raised and sighted. The two men reached the base of the cabin wall. Frank Tolliver struck a match, the small flame bright in the darkness. The rag caught immediately. Josephine and Tatanka fired at the same instant, two shots merging into a single thunderclap that echoed across the prairie. Frank Tolliver collapsed into the snowdrift, his bottle shattering beneath him. Flames spread instantly across the spilled oil, catching his coat, his hair, his skin. He screamed a high, terrible sound, thrashing and rolling in the snow. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. After perhaps 15 seconds, the screaming stopped. The flames continued burning. Jesse Tolliver staggered backward, clutching his shattered leg, where Tatanka's shot had struck just above the knee. He fell hard, his bottle landing intact, but unlit. Blood pumped from the wound in rhythmic spurts that steamed in the cold air. Tatanka vaulted through the window with fluid grace, rolled to absorb impact, and came up running. He reached Jesse in 3 strides, grabbed him by the collar, and dragged him bodily through the snow toward the cabin. Josephine threw the door open. Tatanka shoved the outlaw inside with enough force to send him sprawling. The man was young, maybe 25, with a patchy beard and eyes wide with terror. He reeked of fear, sweat whiskey, and blood. His face had gone the color of old bone. Josephine grabbed harness straps from a peg and tied the man to a wooden chair, pulling the leather tight enough to make him gasp. She had learned to tie knots from Thomas, and her knots did not slip. "Who sent you?" Josephine demanded, kneeling to face him at eye level. The man, Jesse, shook his head, lips pressed together, trying to hold on to some last shred of defiance. Tatanka stepped closer without being asked. He did not touch the prisoner. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, silent and utterly still, his presence filling the small cabin like a thunderhead before a storm. The firelight threw his shadow huge against the wall. Jesse Tolliver broke within 30 seconds. "They call me Cowardly Carl sometimes," he gasped at the humiliating nickname, slipping out before he could censor himself. "Please, for pity's sake, do not let him scalp me. I will tell you everything. Just please stop the bleeding. I do not want to die like this." And he did tell them everything. Dark Dave Mallory's gang had been operating for over 18 months. They rustled cattle from homesteaders, and small ranchers altered the brands with running irons and sold the stock to the railroad at cut-rate prices. They raided Sioux camps dressed as cavalry, then raided white settlements dressed as Sioux, playing both sides against each other to keep the territory unstable. Sheriff Harlan took a cut of every transaction, 20% off the top. The railroad purchasing agent in Mercury Falls, a man named Thaddeus Crow, turned a blind eye as long as the beef kept flowing cheap. A federal land office clerk in Fort Pierre falsified herd counts to create a paper trail that looked legitimate. It was staggeringly profitable. But then the raid on Winona's village 2 days ago had gone wrong. We were supposed to make it look like a cavalry raid. Carl gasped, his face slick with sweat. "Just scatter the people, take some horses, maybe kill 1 or 2 to make it believable. Quick in and out." He coughed and blood flecked his lips. But Dave got drunk on trade whiskey. He gets mean when he drinks. We hit the camp at dawn, and instead of just scaring them, Dave started shooting women, old people, anyone who moved wrong. Killed maybe a dozen people who should have lived. Burned half the lodges. Carl's eyes found Winona, who lay feverish by the hearth. The little girl, she saw everything. Saw Dave's face. Saw Frank heat up the branding iron and mark a dead pony, Dave's own brand, the Circle M, to make it look like the Sioux had stolen white man's stock. He coughed again, weaker. Dave said she had to die. Can't have a witness. If she talks, the whole thing falls apart. The railroad contracts the land, deals the sheriff's protection, all of it. Dave tracked her here, figured he would burn the cabin and everyone in it, make it look like a fight between settlers and hostiles. Josephine felt the pieces click into place with terrible clarity. Winona was not just a child she had saved by accident. The girl was the only witness who could expose a lie profitable enough to start a war. Tatanka's eyes burned with fury so cold it was more terrifying than rage. "Will your law listen to her?" he asked Josephine. "Will they believe a Sioux child over white men with money?" Josephine thought about Sheriff Harlan and the men in the saloon. She thought about federal marshals who took fraud cases seriously because government contracts meant government money. She thought about railroad investors back in Boston and New York who cared deeply about profit margins. "Maybe not my sheriff's law," she said carefully. "But men who count railroad money will listen. Men who investigate government fraud will care. If we can get this man, that brand, and your daughter's testimony to federal marshals before Mallory can silence them, they will act. This is fraud against the United States government and theft from the railroad company. Those crimes they actually prosecute." Tatanka had no faith in white justice, but he understood leverage. Staying here meant death. "Then we move her," he said. "Tonight." Outside, the sky began to spit snow again, fat flakes swirling down the wind, building another long moan. Carl slumped in his chair, unconscious or dead. His testimony had died with him, but his confession had given them something more valuable: understanding. They planned quickly. They would move Winona to a winter camp 2 hours northeast, where lodges could be pitched out of the wind. From there, Tatanka would send riders to Mercury Falls, 30 miles southeast, to reach the telegraph office and send messages to the Federal Marshal's office in St. Louis and the Railroad Security Office in Chicago. Josephine loaded Winona onto Brutus, the mule wrapping the girl in every blanket and buffalo robe. She fashioned a crude sling from a wooden crate and harness leather. Brutus, true to his name, protested until Josephine whispered in his ear and fed him oats. Tatanka and 3 warriors would escort them. The rest would remain here, keeping up sporadic fire to make Mallory think everyone was still trapped. By the time they reached the creek, half a mile from the homestead, the storm had turned savage. Snow drove sideways with vicious force. The wind screamed. Brutus slipped on hidden ice, nearly pitching the crate into frozen water. One warrior's pony went down hard, 4 legs buckling. The pony struggled to rise, eyes rolling white. The warrior checked the animal's legs and shook his head. A tendon injury. The pony could not continue. Winona groaned with every jolt, her voice thin and distant, as if she were already slipping away. A dark figure materialized out of the whiteness ahead, riding hard. Tatanka's rifle came up instantly. Josephine lunged forward, shoving the barrel aside. "Wait!" The rider reined in hard and pulled the scarf from his face. It was Abraham Cole, his beard crusted with ice, his eyes bloodshot, his bad leg clearly causing agony. "You dang fools," he coughed. "You will all die out here. The trail is gone. The temperature is dropping fast enough to kill horses. And the posse from town is riding blind half a mile behind me, shooting at anything that moves. Harlan has got them all worked up, thinking this is the start of a full uprising." He fumbled inside his coat and pulled out a soaked, half-frozen scrap of hide. He held it out toward Tatanka. Carved into the leather was the Circle M brand, the same mark Winona had described, and Carl had confessed to. "Found this 2 months back." Abraham said, his voice rough with shame. "On a dead Sioux pony in a ravine east of my land. Brought it home, looked at it, knew something was wrong, but did not want to see what it meant. Been buying 20 head from Mallory at prices so low, I should have known they were stolen. Been looking the other way because it was easier and cheaper." He looked at Tatanka, then at Josephine, then at the crate holding the dying child. "Figure I owe somebody for that." Maybe I can start paying that debt back now, even if it kills me, which it probably will. Tatanka studied Abraham for a long moment. Abraham Cole was a white man, a former soldier. He had bought stolen cattle and looked away. Every instinct said not to trust him. But he had ridden into a blizzard when he could have stayed safe. He carried proof of the conspiracy, and his eyes held the look of a man who had decided he was dead and was trying to do one decent thing before the end. Tatanka nodded once. Come, but if you betray us, you die slowly. Abraham managed a grim smile. Fair enough. Together they turned back toward the homestead, fighting against the storm. The journey that should have taken 20 minutes stretched to nearly 2 hours. By the time they reached the cabin, Josephine's hands were numb, refusing to respond. Abraham was gray-faced with pain. Winona was barely conscious. At the cabin door, they nearly collided with 2 more arrivals. Dr. Walter Finch stood there, his beard crusted into a solid mass of ice, his medical bag clutched in one frozen hand. Beside him, Estelle Laurent stamped snow from her boots, her face pale but determined. Walter had ridden straight into the storm because he could not live with the thought of children dying when he had skill to prevent it. Took you long enough, Josephine muttered, half sobbing with relief as she pushed the door open. Let us see if we can keep this witness breathing long enough to testify. Walter set his hands already steady as he moved toward the bed where Tatanka was laying Winona. Fever this high in a child this small is dangerous. Infection is setting in. We need to bring the temperature down immediately. Out on the ridge beyond the homestead, hidden in trees and darkness, Dark Dave Mallory watched the cabin with narrowed eyes and growing rage. He had seen riders converging, too many riders from too many directions. The simple ambush had become complicated. But he still had advantages. He had men. He had weapons. He had the posse from town stumbling around ready to shoot at anything. And he had the storm. When this storm is at its worst, he told the 6 men crouched beside him, we go in hard, kill everyone inside. Make it messy enough to blame on hostiles. Leave Sioux weapons, white bodies, burn what is left. By sunrise, this will be the massacre that justifies everything. His men nodded, checking their weapons, waiting for the storm to give them cover. Midnight arrived unmarked. The storm had reached full power, a living entity that battered the cabin with fury that seemed personal. Wind screamed over the roof, forcing smoke down the chimney in choking waves. The cabin was crowded past capacity. Winona on the bed, her fever finally starting to break under Walter's care. Carl's corpse tied to the chair where they had shoved it. Abraham with his back against the door, checking his Colt revolver. Walter forcing willow bark tea between Winona's lips. Estelle feeding the fire. 2 of Tatanka's warriors at loopholes in the logs. Josephine near the window with the flintlock. And Tatanka by the other window, listening to the wind with a hunter's focus. The first bullet came without warning, smashing through the wooden shutter. The slug buried itself in the opposite wall. Dark Dave Mallory and his men had moved under cover of the storm, crawling within 40 yards. Now they opened fire, pouring lead into the structure in continuous barrage designed to create panic. Bullets bit into logs with impacts that shook the walls. One round knocked a lantern from its peg, the glass shattered, flames spreading. Abraham scrambled forward and beat them out, cursing. The room plunged half into shadow. Outside, the posse from White Buffalo stumbled through the blizzard, disoriented and frightened, firing at anything that looked like a hostile position. Dark Dave's men fired back at the posse, deliberately targeting muzzle flashes, trying to create crossfire where no one knew who was shooting at whom. A man staggered to the cabin door, waving his arms desperately, his face a mask of blood. "Hold your fire, blast it, do not shoot, I am..." Abraham started to shout recognition. Billy, one of his ranch hands, but a shot from the confused posse cut him off. Billy jerked as a rifle ball caught him between the shoulder blades. His eyes went wide with shock. Blood bubbled from his lips. He fell forward into the doorway. "Son of a gun!" Abraham snarled, his voice breaking with rage. He grabbed Billy's coat and dragged the body inside, but it was too late. The kid was dead, his eyes still open and staring at nothing. More bullets ripped through the doorway. One grazed Abraham's shoulder, tearing fabric and skin. Another struck Estelle's water bucket, draining precious water across the floor. A flaming bottle arced through the air, spinning end over end. It crashed against the outer wall near the chimney. Coal oil spread instantly, and flames caught with hungry eagerness, licking up toward the eaves. If the blaze reached the roof, the cabin would become an oven. "We break their circle," Tatanka said, his voice cutting through the chaos with cold certainty. "Or we die inside it. There is no third option." There was no debate. Everyone understood. Stay and burn, or move and fight. Josephine grabbed the old flintlock, checked the priming, and lifted the trapdoor to the root cellar, Thomas's bolt hole, a narrow tunnel barely wide enough to crawl through. It led to a hidden exit in a gully behind the homestead. "You know these hills," Josephine said to Tatanka. "I know every stump and rock within 300 yards. We go together, flank them from behind, hit them where they think they are safe." Tatanka looked at her for a long moment, then nodded and followed her down into the darkness. They crawled through the low passage, the ceiling so close it brushed their backs, roots and rocks, scraping at clothing. The air was cold and damp, tasting of soil and decay. Josephine's breath came in short gasps. Behind her, she heard Tatanka's breathing, controlled, and even despite the tight space. They emerged from the hidden hatch into a narrow, snow-choked gully behind the homestead, and the wind hit them with the force of a physical blow. Snow clawed at their faces, got into their eyes, and mouths made every breath a struggle against frozen air. The gully was deep enough to offer some cover, but steep-sided and treacherous with ice. At one collapsed section, Josephine could not find footing. She tried to climb, scrabbling at the frozen slope, but her boots kept sliding backward. Tatanka moved forward, bracing himself. "Step on me," he said, crouching low. She hesitated for only a heartbeat, then did as he directed, placing her boot on his thigh, then his shoulder, using him as a ladder. He boosted her up by the waist, his hands strong and sure, lifting her the last few feet. For a brief moment, their faces were close, his breath warm against her frozen cheek, their eyes locking in an exchange that held recognition and trust and something deeper. She felt the solid strength of him, the heat of his body against the brutal cold. Then she was up and over, and he hauled himself after her with a grunt of effort, and they kept moving. They flanked Mallory's position, circling wide through the storm, using terrain and blizzard for cover. It took 20 agonizing minutes of crawling through snow and cold that bit bone deep, but finally they emerged behind a ragged line of rocks where Dark Dave and 5 men crouched, firing at both cabin and confused posse with methodical efficiency. Dark Dave Mallory was exactly as Carl had described. A big man, thick through the chest, with a cruel face, half hidden by a full beard, wearing a stolen cavalry coat over buckskin leggings. Decorative feathers taken from dead birds or stolen from lodges were tied to his rifle barrel with rawhide in crude attempt to implicate the tribes he was destroying. He laughed as he fired, actually laughed, enjoying the chaos he was orchestrating. Josephine rested the flintlock on a flat stone, her hands almost too numb to feel the wood and metal. Beside her, Tatanka drew his bow with smooth motion, testing the string tension in the brutal cold, knocking an arrow with fletching he had crafted himself. "You take the one in the blue coat," Josephine murmured. Tatanka nodded. They moved as one without counting down, without signal, just shared understanding born of necessity and something deeper. The fight was short, brutal and utterly decisive. Josephine pulled the trigger, feeling the flintlock roar and buck. The heavy lead ball caught one of Mallory's men in the chest, punching through his sternum and destroying his heart. He fell backward into the snow without a sound. Tatanka's arrow flew silent and fast. It took another outlaw in the throat, the broadhead severing both carotid arteries. The man dropped his rifle and fell to his knees, clutching at the shaft, while blood poured between his fingers in rhythmic spurts. He made a wet choking sound, then toppled forward and went still. A third outlaw panicked and fled blindly into the storm. He collided with the equally confused posse, who saw only a shape emerging from white chaos and fired instinctively. Multiple rifles spoke at once. The outlaw's body jerked as at least 4 balls struck home, and he collapsed in a boneless heap. Dark Dave Mallory tried to turn and bring his rifle to bear, but Josephine had already begun reloading hands, moving on pure muscle memory. She caught Mallory in the upper thigh, the ball shattering his femur with an audible crack. He screamed and fell. Tatanka's second arrow, fired almost immediately, buried itself deep in Dark Dave's right shoulder, pinning his gun arm to his side. The rifle clattered uselessly. Mallory collapsed into blood-stained snow, cursing blood, spreading dark beneath him. The pain had to be excruciating, but his eyes still burned with rage. Tatanka was on him in 3 strides. He grabbed Mallory by his coat collar and hauled the wounded outlaw upright with strength that seemed almost casual, ignoring Dave's screams. He dragged him through the snow toward the front of the cabin into the spill of firelight, where the posse could see clearly. Josephine followed, already reloading as she walked. The posse emerged slowly from the storm, a ragged line of perhaps 15 men, rifles raised, but uncertain now. Federal Marshal Coleman was among them, a hard-faced man who had been investigating railroad fraud for months. Josephine reached Dark Dave first. She grabbed his stolen cavalry coat and jerked it open with enough force to tear buttons free. The leather belt beneath was clearly visible, and burned deep into the leather was the Circle M brand that matched the mark on the dead horse she had found weeks ago. She pulled the captured ledger from Dave's saddlebag and held it up. Pages of double entries, falsified herd counts, receipts signed with names from White Buffalo and Mercury Falls. Every transaction documented in careful handwriting that would damn a dozen men. Ask him who paid him. Josephine shouted to the posse and the marshal. Ask him who bought stolen beef with blood money. Ask him who killed women and children and hunted a little girl through a blizzard because she saw his face and knew his crimes. Sheriff Harlan opened his mouth to object, but Federal Marshal Coleman stepped forward, his hand on his revolver. Talk, Coleman said to Dark Dave, his voice flat and cold. Give me names, dates, amounts, or I let the Sioux have you right here and now. Your choice. Make it fast. Under the combined pressure of excruciating pain, federal authority, and the very real threat of being turned over to warriors who had every reason to skin him alive. Slowly, Dark Dave Mallory broke. The confession poured out. He named Sheriff Harlan. He named Thaddeus Crow, the railroad purchasing agent. He named Henderson, the federal land office clerk. He named cattle buyers, land speculators, and several prominent businessmen. He provided dates, amounts, locations of hidden corrals. It was enough evidence to hang 10 men and send 20 more to federal prison. Inside the cabin, while the confession took place outside, Abraham Cole lay propped against the wall beside Winona's bed, his face gray as ash. Earlier, when a ricocheting bullet had screamed through a gap in the logs, heading straight for the child's head, Abraham had thrown himself across her small body without conscious thought. The ball had caught him in the lower left abdomen, tearing through muscle and intestine. Dr. Walter had examined the wound with one brief look and recognized it as fatal. The bullet had perforated the bowel in multiple places. Even in a fully equipped hospital, survival odds would be slim. In a frontier cabin, there was nothing to be done except manage the pain. Walter had given Abraham laudanum enough to dull the worst pain, but not steal consciousness. There would be no heroic surgery. Just time to say goodbye. Abraham held his left hand over the wound, applying pressure from habit. With his right hand, he held the Colt Navy revolver, unwilling to release it, even now. He listened to Dark Dave's confession through the broken shutter and managed a thin smile. "About damn time somebody said it out loud," Abraham whispered. "Been eating that bastard's stolen beef for a year. Glad I lived long enough to see him burn for it. That is something at least." Dr. Walter knelt beside him, checking his pulse. "You did good, Abraham. You rode into the storm when you could have stayed safe. You brought evidence. You saved that child's life with your body. You paid your debt, soldier. You go to whatever comes next with a clean conscience." Abraham's eyes closed slowly. His breathing, already shallow, slowed further, becoming irregular. The hand over the wound went slack. His face relaxed, pain finally leaving him. Dr. Walter checked for a pulse, felt nothing, and gently closed Abraham's eyes. They covered him with a blanket and sat in silence, honoring a man who had done one truly good thing at the end, and died for it. Outside, the storm finally began to ease the wind, dropping from a scream to a moan to a whisper. The snow slowed, then stopped. Dawn came slowly, the sun rising blood-red over a landscape carved in stark contrasts. Bodies lay where they had fallen, dark shapes against pale ground. The homestead still stood, though one side was badly charred. Bullet holes peppered the walls. It would need repairs, but the structure was sound. Federal Marshal Coleman took charge. Dark Dave Mallory was bound, bandaged enough to keep him alive for trial, and loaded into a wagon. Sheriff Harlan was disarmed and placed under arrest. 2 deputies rode hard for Mercury Falls to arrest Thaddeus Crow. The ledger, the branded belt, Carl's earlier confession, and Dark Dave's public breakdown were more than enough evidence to convict. The case would go to federal court in St. Louis, where railroad money and political connections would matter less than documented fraud and murder. A week passed before the ground thawed enough to dig graves. Abraham Cole was buried on a low hill above the creek, in a spot where sunrise would touch the marker first each morning. The funeral was attended by a strange mixed town men: Mexican families, German homesteaders, federal officers, Dr. Walter and Estelle Josephine Winona, and a silent ring of Sioux warriors on the ridge above. Dr. Walter read a short eulogy about a man who had made mistakes, who had looked away when it was easier, but who, when the moment came, had ridden into a blizzard to try to set one thing right, who had brought evidence when he could have stayed ignorant, who had thrown his body over a child to take a bullet meant for her. Abraham Cole died as he should have lived. Walter concluded, his voice breaking. Protecting the innocent, fighting for what was right despite personal cost. That is the measure of a man. May we all find such courage when our moment comes. After most attendees left, Tatanka rode down from the ridge. Josephine met him at the grave marker, a cairn of stones with Abraham's name scratched into slate. She held something Abraham's Gettysburg Medal, a tarnished piece of brass on a faded blue ribbon. She pressed it into Tatanka's calloused palm without speaking. Tatanka studied the medal, turning it over, reading the worn inscription. Then he tucked it carefully into his belt pouch, next to the strip of red cloth that bound his hair and the eagle feathers. "He owed you a debt," Josephine said quietly. "He tried to pay it with his life. That counts for something." Tatanka nodded once. Then he turned and walked back up the hill to where his warriors waited, mounted his horse, and rode away. With Harlan removed and Dark Dave in federal custody, the railroad company moved quickly to contain the scandal. Their new representative, a lawyer from Chicago named Pemberton, arrived by stage and immediately called a meeting. The meeting took place in the back room of the general store, attended by Josephine, Dr. Walter Estelle, Federal Marshal Coleman, and a nervous Pemberton. Josephine laid the ledger on the table, opening it to pages proving falsified delivery counts. Thousands of dollars over 18 months. "You have two choices, Mr. Pemberton," Josephine said calmly. "You can fight this in court for the next 2 years. Let every newspaper print daily stories about how your railroad agents bought stolen beef, paid bribes, falsified documents, and nearly started a war that would have cost millions and killed hundreds. I am quite certain the gentlemen who hold your railroad's paper will enjoy reading about it over breakfast while the trading houses back east drive its value into the dirt." Pemberton's jaw worked, his face flushing. "That is extortion. No, that is justice." Marshal Coleman corrected his hand on his revolver. "And if you prefer, we can go the public trial route. Let a jury decide who they believe." Pemberton glared, but faced with documented evidence, multiple witnesses, federal authority, and the threat of public scandal that would ruin reputations and send his company's papers selling for pennies, he understood negotiation was cheaper than litigation. "What do you want?" he asked through clenched teeth. Josephine pulled out a hand-drawn map showing a narrow crescent of land along the creek, perhaps 300 acres rocky, prone to flooding, but positioned strategically where 3 trails met. "You sign over this land," Josephine said. "Fair deed properly recorded. Title in my name, free and clear. In exchange, I keep this ledger sealed, and you get to bury your scandal quietly. Your agents get prosecuted, but your company's name stays out of the newspapers. 300 acres of marginal land." Pemberton calculated aloud. "Against millions in potential losses. That is the deal." "That is the deal," Josephine confirmed. Pemberton's face was a study in suppressed rage, but he pulled papers from his case and began writing. The deed was drafted, copied from a standard form. Marshal Coleman witnessed it. Dr. Walter witnessed it. Estelle witnessed it. The document was signed, witnessed, and became as legal and binding as any property transfer in the territory. The deed was recorded the next day at the county office, entered into permanent records, stamped with the official seal. The land officially became Josephine's. Later that week, on the ridge above the creek, on an afternoon when the sun showed itself and the temperature climbed above, freezing, Josephine and Tatanka stood looking at the land, now legally hers. "Your people can use this land," Josephine said. "Graze your ponies here in summer when the grass is good. Fish the creek when the salmon run. Cut timber for lodges when you need it, though not so much that we destroy the forest. Camp here when you travel through. No one will bother you as long as I hold the deed." Tatanka was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing the offer and looking for the trap. White people did not simply give land to Indians without strings. "What do you want in return?" he asked bluntly. "Safety," Josephine answered honestly. "I want your young men to watch the telegraph line and the stage road. When real raiders come, and they will, you send word. We deal with them together before they can kill someone and blame your people. We stop the cycle before it starts. That is all I ask." It was not justice in any grand sense. It was not peace in any official capacity. But it was a practical arrangement built on mutual need and hard-earned trust. Tatanka considered for a long time, then nodded slowly. "We will do this," he said. "We will watch. We will send word. But if your people break this agreement, we will remember that too." "Fair enough," Josephine said. "I would not expect anything less." They shook hands, the grip firm, and brief, sealing an agreement that would hold for the next 3 years, until the flood of settlement following the war and the coming of the railroad brought too many people too fast. But for now, it was enough. Winter began its retreat as February gave way to March. Snow shrank back, revealing patches of earth and stubborn shoots of green. Ice melted from the creek, the water running clear and cold. The charred wall of the Hart homestead was rebuilt over 2 weeks, the work done by 3 of Tatanka's warriors skilled with axes, 2 German homesteaders, and 2 former posse members. They worked alongside Josephine, communicating in broken English, halting Lakota she was learning from Winona, and the universal language of shared labor. Winona recovered slowly under Dr. Walter's care. He visited 3 times a week, checking the healed arm wound. The girl was resilient, but trauma ran deeper than physical wounds. She woke screaming from nightmares several times a week. Estelle came even more frequently, bringing books and slate boards, teaching Winona to read and write English while learning Lakota in return. One afternoon in early March, when the sun was warm enough to melt icicles from the eaves, Winona and Estelle arrived together, riding double. They brought primers, chalk, and stubborn determination. Tatanka rode with them as he had every week, accompanied by 2 warriors. He still maintained formality, but each visit found him lingering longer, speaking more freely, the wall between him and Josephine, eroding slowly. He dismounted outside the cabin and stood by the door, waiting. Josephine came out wiping flour from her hands. She had been attempting bread with mixed success. She wishes to learn your letters and numbers. Tatanka said, his English smoother now. To read what men write in contracts and treaties before they sign away our lives and our land. Josephine glanced at Winona, who stood taller now with good food and safety, her wounded arm fully healed, except for a scar, her eyes clear and bright, with intelligence and fierce determination. She can stay here through spring and into summer if she wishes. Josephine offered. Help with the garden, tend the animals, learn to manage a homestead, study with Estelle. I will teach her what I know about surviving out here. It was an extraordinary offer in a time and place where the line between Sioux and settler was usually marked with blood and mutual hatred. Tatanka understood the weight, the vulnerability it required, the trust it demanded. He hesitated, his hand moving unconsciously to touch the cavalry medal tucked into his belt pouch. Then he nodded slowly. She will stay, he said. Learn your ways, your words, your methods. But I will come each week to see her, to know she is well, to maintain our connection. She is Sioux. She will always be Sioux, even if she learns to walk in your world as well. I would not want it any other way, Josephine said honestly. She should know both worlds. That skill might save her life someday, or save her people. Winona ran inside to claim the small bunk nearest the hearth, chattering excitedly in Lakota to Estelle. Tatanka lingered by the doorway. Melt water dripped from the eaves in steady rhythm, marking the slow return of spring. The prairie beyond showed patches of brown earth, now winter's grip finally loosening. The space between Josephine and Tatanka felt charged with something unspoken. She was acutely aware of him, aware of the breadth of his shoulders under the worn wool shirt, aware of the quiet strength in his stance, aware of the way his dark eyes tracked movement with perpetual alertness, aware of the warmth of his presence despite the lingering cold. You could have let her die on your threshold that night, Tatanka said quietly. It would have been easier for you. Safer. No one would have blamed you. You could have burned this house with all of us inside when you arrived. Josephine countered, meeting his gaze steadily. You had the numbers, the anger, the weapons, every reason to take revenge. You could have killed us all and ridden away justified. But you chose differently too. We both stepped sideways when the path ahead called for violence, Tatanka said, and there was something that might have been warmth in his voice, a subtle shift. He made a sound, then soft, barely audible. There was almost a laugh, but not quite, something gentler and more vulnerable. His hand rose, the movement not quite deliberate, as if acting on instinct. He reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she wished, and adjusted the wool scarf at her throat where it had come loose, tucking it closer with surprising gentleness. His fingers, calloused and scarred from decades of survival, brushed against the hollow of her throat just above her collarbone, pausing there for a heartbeat. He could feel her pulse under his fingertips, quick and strong and alive. The contact was brief, careful, almost tentative, the touch of someone unused to gentleness, but trying to remember how. Josephine held very still, her breath catching, acutely aware of every point of contact. His hand was warm despite the cold, steady and sure. The moment stretched and deepened, became something more significant, and then simple adjustment of clothing became acknowledgement of attraction and possibility held carefully in check. Then Tatanka withdrew his hand, slowly, deliberately, and stepped back, though his eyes remained on hers for a moment longer. "The land between our worlds is narrow and treacherous," he said, his voice carrying a note of something like regret or longing or perhaps just realistic assessment. "Full of old wounds and fresh dangers. But we have proven it can be walked if both people step carefully and watch for pitfalls and help each other across the difficult places. That is worth remembering." He mounted his horse in one smooth motion and rode away with his two warriors, their figures becoming silhouettes against the vast Dakota sky, disappearing over the ridge. Josephine stood watching until they were completely gone, her hand unconsciously touching the place where his fingers had rested against her throat, still feeling the ghost of that contact, like warmth absorbed into skin. Inside the cabin, Winona and Estelle had already settled by the fire, bent over a slate board. Winona's tongue poked out between her teeth as she carefully formed letters, copying shapes with painstaking precision. The fire crackled warm and welcoming. Josephine stood in the doorway for another moment, suspended between inside and outside, between past and future, between the solitary survival of the past 3 years and something new and uncertain and potentially dangerous, but also possibly hopeful. Then she turned back inside, closing the door behind her, and joined them. She opened the small wooden trunk tucked under the bed and took out the newly recorded deed to the narrow stretch of riverbank land. On the back, in her careful script, she had already written a name, White Buffalo Crossing. It would be a trading post someday, she had decided. A meeting place where Sioux, German, Mexican, French, and American settler could come together to trade goods and information without rifles raised first. A place where Winona and others like her could learn to navigate both cultures, to read contracts before signing, to be translators not just of language, but of meaning. The deed, acquired through blackmail and signed under economic duress, but absolutely legal, was her quiet rebellion against a world that demanded people choose sides and stay there rigidly. It was proof that one widow, one war leader, and one brave child had carved out a thin strip of shared ground in a brutal landscape, and that ground would be defended for as long as she had breath. For now, for as long as circumstances allowed. Outside, the prairie wind had dropped to barely a whisper, just enough to rustle new grass and carry the sound of the creek running full with snowmelt. The late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting long golden light across the transformed landscape. The world smelled of thaw, of earth, waking from winter sleep, of manure and mud, and the green promise of growing things. Inside the fire, through Josephine's and Winona's shadows long, and merged on the rebuilt wall, two shapes framed by a doorway. There was no longer just the entrance to a lonely homestead, but rather a threshold between worlds that had, through choice and courage and stubborn refusal to accept the expected narrative, chosen not to end in mutual slaughter, but rather in tentative cooperation and the fragile beginning of something that might, with careful tending, grow into understanding. Far to the north, riding through high country toward the winter camp, where his people waited with questions and concerns, Tatanka carried the cavalry medal against his chest in the leather pouch with his most valued possessions. He did not look back toward the Hart homestead. But in his mind, he carried multiple images that would not leave him the widow standing in a doorway unarmed and vulnerable, but unafraid, offering trust when history said she should offer violence. His daughter wrapped in blankets and receiving care from strangers. The white doctor working with the same dedication on a Sioux child as he would on his own kind. And most persistently, Josephine's face in firelight, the feel of her pulse beneath his fingertips, the warmth of her, despite the surrounding cold. It was not love. Not yet, and perhaps it could never be given the complications and barriers and centuries of conflict. But it was something real and earned something forged through fire and fear and the kind of courage that came from choosing mercy and trust when revenge would have been easier. It was enough. For now, riding through early spring toward an uncertain future, it was enough to remember and to know that narrow bridges could be built across wide chasms if both sides were willing to meet in the middle. In the years that followed, 3 good years before everything changed again, with the flood of settlement and the inevitable grinding pressure of expansion, White Buffalo Crossing would become exactly what Josephine had envisioned. It grew into a meeting place, a trading post, and eventually a small school where Estelle taught children of every background. Winona would grow into a young woman who could speak 3 languages, fluently read contracts and legal documents, and negotiate with railroad men and federal agents on behalf of her people with skill that saved lives. Tatanka would visit often, and with each visit the distance he maintained from Josephine's door would grow shorter, and the duration of his stays longer, until one spring day, when the prairie was covered with wildflowers, he would simply walk through that door and stay building a life that bridged 2 worlds, imperfectly but genuinely. But that was still to come. Still uncertain, still dependent on choices not yet made. For now, on this March afternoon in 1869, there was only the quiet satisfaction of survival against long odds, the warmth of a rebuilt home, the sound of a child learning letters by firelight, and the thin, fragile, precious hope that the narrow strip of shared ground they had carved out with blood and stubbornness might hold long enough to matter. Might grow into something larger, might prove that different peoples could walk together through hostile territory if they were willing to step carefully and catch each other when one stumbled. The door stood open now to the spring air, no longer barred against enemies, framing a view of the prairie coming back to life after winter's brutal siege. Inside and outside, merged in that threshold space. And for this moment at least, the boundary between worlds seemed less like a wall and more like a bridge still under construction, but bearing weight.